The scream that pierced through the Martinez family home at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening would haunt Elena Rodriguez for the rest of her life, not with guilt, but with the sweet satisfaction of justice finally served. What her mother-in-law discovered in that pristine kitchen would unravel 15 years of carefully constructed lies, expose the rot beneath a perfect family facade, and prove that sometimes the quietest people make the loudest statements when pushed too far. Elena Rodriguez had always been the type of woman who measured her worth in the smiles of others. At 34, she possessed the kind of gentle beauty that whispered rather than shouted, warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she laughed, dark hair that she kept in a practical bun, and hands that seemed to have been crafted specifically for nurturing. She had spent the last 15 years of her marriage perfecting the art of making herself smaller, quieter, more convenient for the Martinez family dynasty. The Martinez household operated like a well-oiled machine, with Elena as its silent engine. She had married David Martinez when she was 19, young and desperately in love with his easy charm and the promise of belonging to something bigger than herself. What she hadn't anticipated was that bigger would mean becoming invisible within it. The family home, a sprawling two-story colonial in the affluent suburb of Westchester, had never felt like home to Elena. It belonged to David's mother, Carmen Martinez, a formidable woman in her 70s who ruled her domain with the iron fist of someone who had never been told no. Carmen had made it abundantly clear from day one that Elena was a temporary addition to their perfect family, a phase that David would eventually outgrow. Mija, Carmen would say, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "Could you handle dinner tonight? David's been working so hard, and you know how he likes your cooking." It was never a request. In 15 years, Elena couldn't remember Carmen ever actually asking her to do anything, only informing her of what needed to be done. David's sister, Isabella, lived in the guest house behind the main property with her 2 teenage children. At 42, Isabella had never married, had never worked a day in her life, and had perfected the art of emotional manipulation to a degree that would impress therapists worldwide. She treated Elena like hired help, expecting meals delivered to her door, laundry folded and returned, and childcare provided whenever the mood struck her to disappear for days at a time. "Elena's so good with kids," Isabella would announce whenever she wanted to abandon her parental responsibilities. "The kids just love their tia, Elena, more than boring old mom anyway." The children, Miguel, 16, and Sofia, 14, had learned to see Elena as a convenience rather than a person, much like their mother and grandmother had taught them. But it was David's betrayal that cut the deepest. The man she had fallen in love with at 19 had slowly morphed into a stranger who found it easier to let his family treat his wife like a servant than to stand up for her. When Elena would try to talk to him about the constant demands, the lack of respect, the way she felt like a ghost in her own life, David would sigh heavily and mutter something about keeping the peace, and, "You know how family is." "Elena, you're being dramatic," became his standard response to her pain. "Mom doesn't mean anything by it. Isabella's going through a hard time. The kids need stability. You're so good at taking care of everyone, it would be selfish to stop now." Selfish. The word had become Elena's personal poison, administered in small doses whenever she showed signs of having needs, wants, or boundaries of her own. The surgery had been scheduled for months. Elena's gallbladder had been causing her excruciating pain for over a year, pain she had initially hidden because there was always something more important happening in the Martinez household. David's promotion, Isabella's latest drama, Carmen's bridge club events that required elaborate catering. By the time Elena couldn't hide her condition anymore, she needed emergency surgery. "It's laparoscopic," the surgeon had explained kindly. "Minimally invasive, but you'll still need significant recovery time. No lifting anything over 5 pounds for at least 2 weeks, no strenuous activity for a month. Your body needs time to heal." Elena had nodded, already mentally calculating how she could manage the household duties with her restrictions. She didn't notice the doctor's concerned expression as he watched her prioritize everyone else's needs over her own recovery. The night before her surgery, Elena had spent hours preparing. She made 3 different casseroles and froze them with detailed reheating instructions. She stocked the pantry, organized meal plans, and even pre-washed and organized clothes for everyone. She left detailed notes about the children's schedules, Carmen's medication times, and Isabella's dietary preferences. "You don't need to do all this," David had said half-heartedly, but he hadn't moved to stop her or offer to help. He'd been too busy on his phone, managing some work crisis that couldn't wait. "I just want to make sure everyone's taken care of while I recover," Elena had replied, and she meant it. Even facing surgery, her first instinct was to minimize the inconvenience her healing would cause everyone else. Carmen had walked through the kitchen that evening, surveying Elena's preparations with the critical eye of a general inspecting troops. "I suppose this will have to do," she'd said finally. "Though I don't know how we'll manage with you laid up for weeks. David never learned to cook properly, and Isabella can barely boil water." Elena had felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the one that came whenever she was reminded that her value lay solely in what she could provide for others. "I'll recover as quickly as possible," she'd promised, already dreading the guilt she'd feel for every day she couldn't perform her duties. As she'd lain in bed that night, David already asleep beside her, Elena had stared at the ceiling and wondered when she had become so afraid of taking up space in her own life. She remembered the young woman she'd been at 19, full of dreams, laughter, and opinions. That girl had wanted to be a teacher, had loved to paint, had believed that marriage meant partnership and mutual respect. Somewhere along the way, that girl had been slowly, systematically erased, replaced by a woman whose entire identity revolved around being useful to people who had never once asked what she needed. The surgery was scheduled for 7 a.m. on a Monday morning. As Elena's alarm went off at 5:30, she realized that for the first time in 15 years, she was about to do something that was entirely for herself, something that would force the Martinez family to function without her for a few precious weeks. She had no idea that those few weeks would change everything, or that the lessons she was about to teach them would come at a cost none of them were prepared to pay. The recovery room was a cocoon of beeping machines and antiseptic calm that Elena wished she could stay in forever. For the first time in 15 years, no one needed her to do anything except exist and heal. The nurses were kind but professional, checking her vitals and pain levels without expecting her to minimize her discomfort or apologize for taking up their time. The surgery went perfectly, Dr. Ramirez told her as she emerged from anesthesia. "But I want to be very clear about your recovery instructions. No lifting, no bending, no strenuous activity for at least 2 weeks. Your body has been through trauma, and it needs time to heal properly." Elena nodded, though part of her was already calculating how she could modify these instructions to accommodate her family's needs. Old habits died hard, even when medically inadvisable. David arrived at the hospital looking harried and checking his phone constantly. "How are you feeling?" he asked, but his eyes were already scanning her chart and the discharge paperwork. "When can we get you home?" Mom's already called twice asking about dinner plans. The ride home was uncomfortable in more ways than one. Every bump in the road sent sharp pains through Elena's tender abdomen, but David was too busy complaining about having to take time off work to notice her wincing. "This couldn't have come at a worse time," he muttered. "The Henderson project is in crisis mode, and I'm supposed to be leading the client presentation next week." When they arrived home, Carmen was waiting in the foyer with a list. Literally. She had written a detailed list of tasks on the back of an envelope and thrust it at Elena before she'd even made it through the door. "I know you're recovering, Mija, but these things can't wait," Carmen announced. "The dry cleaning needs to be picked up tomorrow. Sophia needs her school uniform washed for the field trip on Wednesday, and I completely forgot that Isabella promised to bring appetizers to book club on Thursday." Elena stared at the list, the pain medication making the words swim slightly. "I can't drive for at least 3 days," she said slowly. "And I'm not supposed to lift anything." "Oh, you don't need to lift anything heavy," Carmen waved dismissively. "Just the light stuff. And David can drive you to the dry cleaners on his way to work." "Mom," David interrupted, "Elena just had surgery. She needs to rest." For a moment, Elena felt a surge of hope. Finally, David was going to stand up for her, prioritize her health over his family's convenience. Of course she needs rest, Carmen agreed readily. That's why I'm only asking for the essential things. Nothing that requires heavy lifting or too much standing. Elena realized with crystalline clarity that Carmen had redefined essential to mean everything Elena normally does, but with creative justifications for why it's not too strenuous. The first few days blurred together in a haze of pain medication and increasing frustration. Elena had positioned herself on the living room couch, which gave her a clear view of the kitchen and family room. What she saw was both enlightening and infuriating. Carmen would walk past Elena's makeshift recovery station multiple times a day, sighing heavily and muttering just loudly enough to be heard. I suppose I'll have to figure out lunch myself. I don't know how Elena expects us to manage with these frozen casseroles. Isabella's children need proper meals, not this thrown-together nonsense. The guilt worked exactly as intended. By day 3, Elena was dragging herself to the kitchen to prepare fresh meals, moving slowly and carefully, but still prioritizing everyone else's comfort over her own healing. Isabella had taken Carmen's passive-aggressive approach and amplified it to an art form. She would appear in the living room with her children in tow, looking helpless and overwhelmed. Elena, I hate to bother you while you're recovering, she would begin, her voice dripping with false concern. But Miguel has this huge project due tomorrow, and I promised I'd help him with research. Could you maybe just throw together something quick for dinner? Nothing fancy. Maybe that pasta dish you make that the kids love. When Elena would hesitate, Isabella would deploy her secret weapon, the children themselves. Please, Tia Elena? Sophia would plead with those big brown eyes that reminded Elena of David at that age. Mom's pasta always turns out weird, and you know how to make it perfect. By the end of the first week, Elena was spending more time on her feet than she was resting. She was preparing meals, doing light cleaning, managing schedules, and providing emotional support to everyone in the household. The only difference between her pre-surgery routine and her current one was that now she moved more slowly and had to take frequent breaks to manage her pain. The breaking point came on Friday evening of her first week home. Elena had spent the day preparing for Isabella's book club event, making elaborate appetizers despite the fact that bending over the counter sent sharp pains through her healing incisions. She'd also managed lunch for everyone, helped Miguel with his homework, driven Sophia to a friend's house, against medical advice, and dealt with Carmen's complaints about the grocery shopping that hadn't gotten done. As Elena carefully arranged the last of the canapes on serving platters, her hands shaking slightly from exhaustion and pain, Carmen entered the kitchen and surveyed her work with a critical eye. These look a bit sloppy, Carmen observed. I hope Isabella's book club friends don't judge our family based on presentation. You know how important first impressions are. Something cold and hard settled in Elena's chest. She looked at Carmen, really looked at her, and saw not a concerned mother-in-law but a woman who had spent 15 years systematically destroying Elena's sense of self-worth. I had surgery 8 days ago, Elena said quietly. Of course, Smija, Carmen replied brightly. And you're healing so well. I knew you were stronger than those doctors thought. All that fuss about no lifting and complete rest. Doctors these days are so overcautious. Elena stared at the appetizers she'd spent 3 hours preparing while her body screamed in protest. She thought about the young woman she'd been at 19, full of fire and dreams and self-respect. That woman would never have accepted this treatment. That woman had been systematically murdered over 15 years, and Elena was just now realizing she could choose to resurrect her. The second week of Elena's recovery marked the beginning of her true healing, not just physical, but psychological. For the first time in 15 years, she began saying no. It started small. When Carmen asked her to reorganize the pantry because you're just sitting there anyway, Elena replied, No, I'm recovering from surgery. When Isabella appeared with a basket of laundry and a sob story about being overwhelmed, Elena said, No, that's not my responsibility right now. The word felt foreign in her mouth at first, like speaking a language she'd forgotten. But each time she used it, it became more natural, more powerful. The Martinez family's reaction was swift and predictable. Carmen began what Elena privately called the martyrdom campaign, sighing heavily while doing simple tasks, muttering about having to do everything herself at 73, and making pointed comments about how some people prioritize their own comfort over family needs. Isabella escalated to tears. She would sit beside Elena's couch, dabbing at her eyes with tissues while describing how overwhelming it was to manage her children's needs without help. "I don't understand what's happened to you," she would sniffle. "You used to be so caring, so giving. Now you're so selfish." There was that word again. Selfish. Elena had been conditioned to fear it, to see it as the worst possible thing she could be. But lying on that couch, watching Isabella's performance, Elena began to wonder, what was so terrible about prioritizing her own needs occasionally? David's response was perhaps the most revealing. He seemed genuinely confused by Elena's newfound boundaries, like a child whose favorite toy had suddenly stopped working. "I don't understand what's wrong with you," he said one evening after Elena had refused to help him prepare a presentation for work. "You've always helped me with these things. We're supposed to be a team." "A team?" Elena repeated slowly. "When was the last time you helped me with something I needed?" David blinked, clearly scrambling for an answer. I help with lots of things. I took you to the hospital for surgery." "That was 11 days ago," Elena pointed out. "What have you done to help with my recovery?" "I've been giving you space to rest," David replied, as if this was a generous gift rather than basic human decency. During those long days on the couch, Elena began paying attention to the household dynamics with fresh eyes. She watched Carmen command Isabella like a puppet, and Isabella pass that learned helplessness down to her children. She observed David navigate his family by finding the path of least resistance, which invariably meant sacrificing Elena's needs to avoid conflict with his mother and sister. The Martinez family system was a perfectly functioning machine designed to extract maximum labor and emotional support from Elena while giving her minimal respect or consideration in return. And Elena had been a willing participant, confusing her own exploitation with love and dedication. On day 10 of her recovery, Elena made a decision that would have been unthinkable 2 weeks earlier. She called her sister Maria. Elena and Maria had once been close, but the demands of the Martinez family had gradually consumed all of Elena's time and emotional energy. Maria had tried to maintain their relationship for years, but Elena had consistently prioritized her in-laws' needs over her own family. Eventually, Maria had stopped calling, tired of competing with people who didn't even appreciate Elena's sacrifices. "Elena?" Maria's voice was surprised and cautious when she answered the phone. "Is everything okay?" "I had surgery last week," Elena said, and then found herself crying for the first time since her ordeal began. Not the careful, quiet tears she'd learned to shed in private, but deep, body-shaking sobs that came from a place of grief she hadn't even known existed. Maria listened as Elena poured out 15 years of suppressed pain, frustration, and loneliness. She described the daily indignities, the constant demands, the way she'd become invisible in her own life. She talked about David's indifference, Carmen's manipulation, and Isabella's parasitic dependency. "Oh, Elena," Maria said when she finally ran out of words. "I've been watching this happen for years, wanting to say something, but you seemed so committed to making that family happy. I was afraid you'd choose them over our relationship if I criticized them." "I probably would have," Elena admitted. "I was so deep in it, I couldn't see how bad it had gotten." "What do you want to do about it?" Maria asked gently. Elena was quiet for a long moment. What did she want? For 15 years, her wants had been so sublimated to everyone else's needs that she'd almost forgotten she was allowed to have them. "I want to remember who I used to be," Elena said finally. "And I want them to understand what they've taken for granted." By the start of her 3rd week of recovery, Elena had made her decision. She would return to her duties, but not as the same woman who had gone into surgery 3 weeks ago. This Elena had a plan, and more importantly, she had something she'd lost years ago: self-respect. The first phase of her plan was deceptively simple. She would resume all her household duties with mechanical precision, but she would strip away every ounce of love, care, and personal investment that had once motivated her work. She would give the Martinez family exactly what they had always treated her as, a service provider, nothing more. Monday morning, Elena rose early and prepared breakfast as she always had. But instead of the carefully planned, nutritionally balanced meals she usually crafted with each family member's preferences in mind, she made exactly what was written on the grocery list Carmen had given her weeks ago: oatmeal, toast, and coffee. No fresh fruit arranged artfully on the side, no special preparation of David's eggs the way he liked them, no accommodation for Isabella's ever-changing dietary restrictions. "This is plain," Carmen observed, poking at her oatmeal with obvious disappointment. "It's what was on the list," Elena replied evenly, already moving to clean up the kitchen. The beauty of aggressive compliance was that it made everyone's demands visible. For years, Elena had been reading minds, anticipating needs, and going above and beyond to make everyone's life easier. Now, they were learning how much invisible labor she had been providing and how much they had been taking for granted. Elena had also been making practical preparations. She had quietly transferred money to a separate bank account, researched apartment rentals, and contacted the school district about returning to teaching. For the first time since her marriage, she was creating options for herself. But the most important part of Elena's plan was yet to come. She was preparing for the conversation that would determine the future of her marriage and her relationship with the Martinez family. She was gathering evidence of a pattern of behavior that had slowly eroded her sense of self over 15 years. Elena was breaking a cycle that had been generations in the making. Carmen had raised her children to be dependent and entitled. Isabella was passing those same patterns to Miguel and Sofia. David had learned that his needs would always be prioritized over everyone else's, including his wife's. Elena's strike was about more than just getting respect for herself. She was trying to give her family the gift of competence, self-reliance, and the understanding that relationships should be based on mutual care rather than one-sided service. But she was also preparing for the possibility that they would choose their dysfunction over growth. And if they made that choice, Elena was finally ready to choose herself. 3.5 weeks after her surgery, Elena's carefully orchestrated lesson in respect and boundaries reached its climax during what would later be known in Martinez family lore as the Tuesday that changed everything. The day began like any other in Elena's new regime of aggressive compliance and emotional detachment. She prepared a basic breakfast, completed her assigned tasks with mechanical precision, and watched with anthropological fascination as her family struggled to adapt to her transformation. But Carmen Martinez was nothing if not persistent. Having spent 7 decades perfecting the art of manipulation, she wasn't going to be defeated by her daughter-in-law's sudden backbone. Carmen had been escalating her tactics for days, and Tuesday morning brought her nuclear option, the guilt-laden medical emergency. "Elena, Mija," Carmen called weakly from her bedroom at 10 a.m. "I'm feeling very dizzy today. I think it might be my blood pressure. Could you check on me every few minutes? And maybe prepare some of that special soup you make when I'm not feeling well?" Elena paused in her dusting and considered Carmen's request. The special soup was a complex, labor-intensive recipe that required hours of preparation and constant attention. It was also Carmen's go-to demand whenever she felt Elena was becoming too independent. "I'll call your doctor and schedule an appointment," Elena replied. "If you're genuinely concerned about your blood pressure, you should see a medical professional." "Oh, no," Carmen said quickly. "I don't need a doctor. I just need some tender loving care for my family. You know how your soup always makes me feel better." Elena recognized the trap. Carmen was betting that Elena's compassion would override her boundaries, that the possibility of a real medical issue would send Elena running back into her old patterns of sacrificial caregiving. "I can make you some canned soup," Elena offered. "Chicken noodle or tomato?" The silence from Carmen's room was deafening. Elena had called her bluff, and they both knew it. By noon, Carmen had made a miraculous recovery and was in the kitchen, watching Elena prepare lunch with the intensity of a general studying enemy troop movements. "This family is falling apart," Carmen announced dramatically. "Look at this house. Look at how we're all living. Elena, I don't know what's happened to you, but this isn't the woman David married." Elena looked up from the sandwiches she was assembling with machine-like efficiency. You're absolutely right, she said calmly. The woman David married was 19 years old, full of dreams, and believed that marriage was a partnership between equals. That woman has been systematically erased over the past 15 years. Carmen's eyes flashed with anger. That woman was selfish and needed to learn what family means. I taught you how to be a proper wife and daughter-in-law. You taught me how to be a servant, Elena corrected. There's a difference. The confrontation that had been building for weeks finally erupted. How dare you? Carmen's voice rose to a pitch that could shatter glass. After everything this family has done for you, we welcomed you with open arms. We gave you a home. We treated you like our own daughter. Elena set down her knife and turned to face Carmen fully. You gave me a list of duties and called it love. You welcomed me as long as I remained grateful and subservient. And you treated me like your own daughter, which explains a lot about how Isabella turned out. Carmen gasped as if Elena had physically struck her. Isabella is going through a difficult time. She needs support, not judgment. Isabella is 42 years old and has never learned to function as an adult because you've spent her entire life doing everything for her, Elena replied. Just like you expected me to do everything for David and for you and for her children. You've created a family of emotional invalids. The kitchen door swung open, and Isabella entered mid-conversation, clearly having heard the raised voices. What's going on? Mom, why are you yelling? Your sister-in-law has lost her mind, Carmen declared. She's being cruel and selfish, and she's tearing this family apart. Isabella looked between her mother and Elena with a confused expression of someone who had never been required to navigate conflict without someone else managing it for her. Elena, whatever's wrong, we can talk about it. Family is supposed to support each other. Support, Elena repeated thoughtfully. When was the last time anyone in this family supported me? When was the last time anyone asked what I needed, what I wanted, or how I was feeling? Isabella blinked rapidly, clearly struggling to process the question. But you always seem so happy to help. You never said you didn't want to do things. Because I was trained not to say it, Elena replied. I was trained to believe that having needs made me selfish, that asking for help made me ungrateful, and that my value as a person was measured entirely by my usefulness to others. The argument had attracted David's attention, and he entered the kitchen looking harried and annoyed. What's all the shouting about? I'm trying to work from home today, and I can hear you three from upstairs. Elena looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw a man who had just complained about being disturbed by his wife finally standing up for herself after 15 years of silent suffering. We're discussing the division of labor in this household, Elena said calmly. Oh, for crying out loud, David sighed. Elena, can't you just, I don't know, compromise? Everyone's upset, and I have a deadline to meet. Elena stared at David in amazement. His wife was having the most important conversation of their marriage. His mother and sister were in the middle of a breakdown over their dysfunctional family dynamics, and his primary concern was returning to his office. Compromise, Elena repeated slowly. David, what exactly should I compromise? Should I compromise my health by working through my recovery? Should I compromise my dignity by accepting disrespect? Should I compromise my sanity by continuing to live as everyone's servant? David looked genuinely confused, as if Elena was speaking a foreign language. You're not a servant. You're family. Family helps each other. When have you helped me? Elena asked. David gestured vaguely around the kitchen. I work to support this family. I pay for everything. I provide for everyone. You write checks, Elena corrected. I provide emotional support, domestic labor, childcare, elder care, social coordination, and household management. You provide money in exchange for me providing everything else that makes a family function. That's how marriage works, David said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. That's how employment works, Elena replied. Marriage is supposed to be a partnership. Carmen had been building up steam during this exchange, and she finally exploded. Partnership? Partnership? Elena, you have lived in luxury for 15 years. You have a beautiful home, financial security, and a family that loves you. And this is how you repay us? With ingratitude and selfishness. Elena looked around the kitchen where she had spent countless hours preparing meals for people who criticized her efforts, the kitchen where she had worked through illness and exhaustion, the kitchen where she had slowly lost herself in service to others. You're right, Elena said finally. This is exactly how I'm going to repay 15 years of being taken for granted. She walked to the phone and dialed her sister's number. Maria? It's Elena. I'm ready to come stay with you for a while. Yes, today? No, I'll explain later. She hung up and turned to face the three people who had shaped her adult life. I'm leaving for a few weeks to think about what I want my future to look like. When I come back, we're going to have a very different kind of conversation about how this family functions. You can't just leave, Carmen shrieked. What about dinner? What about the children? What about learning to function like adults? Elena interrupted. Miguel is 16 and Sofia is 14. They're old enough to help with household tasks. Isabella, you're 42. You're old enough to raise your own children. Carmen, you managed to run a household for decades before I arrived. David, you're a grown man who should be capable of basic domestic tasks. Elena paused at the kitchen doorway and looked back at her family. I've been enabling all of you to remain helpless for 15 years. I'm not going to do it anymore. While I'm gone, you'll discover exactly how much I actually do around here. As Elena walked upstairs to pack, she could hear the chaos erupting behind her. Carmen was crying dramatically, Isabella was having what sounded like a panic attack, and David was demanding to know what Elena expects him to do about dinner. For the first time in 15 years, that wasn't Elena's problem to solve. Elena stayed with her sister Maria for exactly 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which she slept until her body naturally woke up, ate meals when she was hungry rather than when others demanded to be fed, and slowly remembered what it felt like to exist for herself rather than in service to others. Maria's apartment was small but peaceful, decorated with the art and books that reflected her sister's personality and interests. Elena had forgotten that people were allowed to have spaces that reflected who they were rather than what others needed them to be. You can stay as long as you need, Maria said on Elena's first morning there, setting a cup of coffee beside her sister's bed. But I think we should talk about what you want to happen next. Elena sipped the coffee, made exactly how she liked it, because Maria had bothered to remember and consider the question. For 3 weeks, she had been running on adrenaline and righteous anger. Now, in the quiet of her sister's spare room, she had to decide what came next. I love David, Elena said finally. Or, at least, I love who he used to be. But I don't know if that person still exists, or if he's just been consumed by his family's dysfunction. What would it take for you to go back? Maria asked gently. Elena thought about it for a long time. Complete change, she said eventually. Not just from David, but from all of them. They would have to acknowledge what they've done, take responsibility for their behavior, and prove that they can function as healthy adults. And David would have to choose me over his family's comfort for once in his life. And if they can't do that? Elena met her sister's eyes. Then I'll file for divorce and start over. I'm only 34. I have a teaching degree and enough money saved to get my own place. I can build a life where I'm valued for who I am, not what I provide. The conversation gave Elena clarity about what she needed to do. She spent the next 2 weeks preparing for her return, but not in the way she would have before. Instead of planning meals and organizing schedules, she researched divorce lawyers, updated her teaching credentials, and wrote down exactly what she would require from the Martinez family if their relationships were to continue. Meanwhile, at the Martinez house, chaos had descended like a biblical plague. The first week without Elena had been manageable, though stressful. David had ordered takeout for dinner every night, paying exorbitant delivery fees rather than learning to cook. Carmen had complained constantly about the quality of restaurant food and the expense, but she hadn't offered to cook herself. Isabella had fed her children cereal for most meals and let the laundry pile up until Miguel ran out of clean school clothes. By the second week, the cracks were showing. David had missed an important client meeting because he couldn't find a clean shirt and had forgotten to pick up his dry cleaning. Carmen had run out of her blood pressure medication because Elena wasn't there to track and refill her prescriptions. Sophia had missed a school project deadline because no one had helped her get supplies or remembered to check her assignment calendar. Isabella had tried to hire a cleaning service, but they wanted more money than the family had ever paid Elena for her round-the-clock availability. The housekeepers also refused to do personal shopping, child transportation, medication management, or any of the 100 other tasks Elena had handled seamlessly. "It's impossible to replace Elena," Isabella complained to David after the third cleaning service quit. "These people want to be paid like professionals, but they won't even stay late when we need them to." "Maybe that's because they are professionals," David had replied, too exhausted from managing his own basic needs to cushion his sister's feelings the way Elena always had. By the third week, Carmen had stopped cooking the elaborate meals she'd once criticized Elena for not preparing perfectly. She was living on sandwiches and canned soup, the same meals she declared unacceptable when Elena had offered them during her recovery. Miguel and Sophia had been forced to learn basic life skills out of necessity. Miguel had figured out how to operate the washing machine after wearing the same gym clothes for 3 days straight. Sophia had learned to pack her own lunch after going hungry when no one remembered to prepare it for her. The house that had once run like clockwork had devolved into barely functional chaos. Everyone was irritated, exhausted, and beginning to realize the enormous scope of work Elena had been doing invisibly for 15 years. When Elena returned on a Thursday afternoon, she found David in the kitchen, staring helplessly at a pile of bills and appointment reminders that had been accumulating on the counter. "Elena," he said, his voice cracking with relief. "Thank God you're back. I don't know how you kept track of all this stuff. I missed the mortgage payment. Mom's doctor called 3 times about a missed appointment, and I think the car registration expired last month." Elena set down her suitcase and looked around the kitchen she had once managed with effortless precision. Dishes were piled in the sink, mail was scattered across every surface, and the refrigerator was nearly empty except for expired condiments and takeout containers. "We need to talk," Elena said calmly. David's face lit up with hope. "Yes, absolutely. I know you were upset when you left, but now that you've had some time to cool down, we can get back to normal." "There is no back to normal," Elena replied. "Normal was me sacrificing my health, dignity, and personhood to enable this family's dysfunction. I'm not going back to that." David's hopeful expression faltered. "What do you mean?" Elena pulled out the list she had written during her time away. "I mean that if you want me to stay in this marriage, things are going to change completely. First, you and I are going to marriage counseling. Not just a few sessions to fix me back into being compliant, but real therapy to address the fundamental problems in our relationship." David opened his mouth to protest, but Elena held up her hand. "Second, household responsibilities will be divided equally among all adults in this house. Carmen is 73, not 93. She's perfectly capable of managing her own medication, appointments, and basic needs. Isabella is a grown woman who needs to take full responsibility for her children's care, her own living space, and her own life." "But Elena," David started, "you know how they are." "I know exactly how they are," Elena interrupted. "The question is whether you're willing to stop enabling their learned helplessness and start expecting them to function like adults." Elena continued reading from her list. "Third, I'm returning to work. I'm going back to teaching, which means I won't be available as the family's on-call domestic manager. Fourth, we're moving out of your mother's house within 6 months and establishing our own household with our own rules." David's face had gone pale. "Elena, you're asking me to choose between you and my family." "No," Elena said firmly. "I'm asking you to choose between enabling dysfunction and building a healthy marriage. Your family can be part of our lives, but they can't be our lives. And they certainly can't continue to treat me like unpaid help." At that moment, Carmen and Isabella entered the kitchen, having clearly been listening from the hallway. "Elena!" Carmen exclaimed, rushing forward with outstretched arms. "Mija, we've missed you so much. The house has been falling apart without you." Elena stepped back, avoiding Carmen's embrace. The house has been falling apart because none of you ever learned to maintain it yourselves." Isabella looked tearful and desperate. "Elena, I know we haven't always appreciated everything you do, but nothing." Elena cut her off. "For 15 years, I've been your unpaid nanny, housekeeper, cook, chauffeur, and emotional support system. I've worked through illness, sacrificed my own dreams, and made myself invisible so all of you could live in comfortable dysfunction." Carmen's expression shifted from false sweetness to indignation. "How can you be so ungrateful? We gave you a home, a family." "You gave me a job," Elena corrected. "An unpaid, thankless job with no benefits, no time off, and no respect. That's not family. That's exploitation." The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of Isabella's quiet sobbing. David stood frozen between his wife and his family, his face reflecting the internal war Elena had watched him fight and lose for 15 years. "What do you want from us?" David asked finally. Elena looked at her husband, the man she had loved since she was 19, the man who had stood by and watched his family diminish her for a decade and a half, and made her final offer. "I want you to choose," she said quietly. "Choose the comfortable dysfunction of enabling your mother and sister to remain emotional children, or choose the harder work of building a partnership with your wife. Choose the familiar patterns that keep everyone helpless, or choose growth and change that will make everyone stronger." Elena paused, looking around the kitchen that had been her prison for so many years. "But understand this. I'm done being the sacrifice that makes everyone else's life easier. With or without you. I'm building a life where I'm valued, respected, and free to be myself." David stared at her for a long moment, and Elena could see the exact moment when he made his choice. His shoulders sagged, and he looked toward his mother and sister with the expression of someone accepting a burden he was too weak to put down. "Elena, please," he said. "Can't we just find a middle ground? Some kind of compromise that works for everyone?" Elena felt something inside her chest, not break, but settle into place with a sense of finality. She had her answer. "There is no middle ground between respect and disrespect," she said calmly. "There is no compromise between being valued and being used. There is no middle way between partnership and servitude." She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the kitchen door, pausing only to look back at the three people who had shaped her adult life. "I'll be staying at Maria's while I look for my own apartment," she said. "David, you can reach me through my attorney when you're ready to discuss divorce proceedings." As Elena walked out of the Martinez house for the final time, Carmen's voice rose behind her. "You'll be back. You'll never find anyone who loves you the way this family does." Elena paused on the threshold and smiled, a real smile, full of freedom and possibility. "You're absolutely right," she called back. "I'll never find anyone who loves me the way this family does. I'm going to find people who love me better." The scream that had opened this story came 6 months later, when Carmen Martinez opened Elena's final gift to the family, a comprehensive manual Elena had written during her recovery, detailing every single task she had performed for 15 years. Every meal planned, every appointment scheduled, every emotional crisis managed, every invisible act of service that had kept the Martinez household functioning. The manual was titled, "What Elena Actually Did," a complete guide to the unpaid labor you took for granted. It included detailed instructions for every household task, complete with time estimates, skill requirements, and the emotional labor involved in managing a family of adults who had never learned to manage themselves. Carmen's scream wasn't one of anger, it was one of recognition. For the first time in her 73 years, she understood exactly how much work it took to create the comfortable life she had demanded others provide for her. Elena had built the life she deserved. She returned to teaching, found an apartment filled with her own books and art, and eventually fell in love with a man who valued her partnership rather than her service. She learned to paint again, traveled to places she had only dreamed of, and discovered the profound joy of living for herself rather than in service to others' endless needs. The Martinez family never recovered from Elena's departure. David, unable to function without someone managing his life, moved back in with his mother permanently. Isabella's children, forced to develop independence, eventually distanced themselves from their dysfunctional family system. Carmen spent her remaining years bitter and alone, finally understanding too late that love is not the same as labor, and that the people who serve you are not automatically obligated to sacrifice themselves for your comfort. Elena kept the manual as a reminder, not of the years she had lost, but of the strength she had found. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's dysfunction, even when it means walking away from everything you once thought you wanted. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that you teach people how to treat you, and sometimes the only way to change the lesson is to stop being available for the class.